Blood streaked across the darkening sky as Zoe Parker stumbled through the rocky terrain, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other grasping at scrub brush to steady herself on the uneven ground. 6 months pregnant and alone in the New Mexico territory of 1878, she had chosen the uncertain dangers of the wilderness over the certain horrors of captivity. "Hold on, little one," she whispered to her unborn child, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she paused to rest against a large boulder. The dusty horizon stretched endlessly before her, and with the sun rapidly setting, panic threatened to overwhelm her. 3 days ago, she had escaped from the abandoned mine, where Jesse Thornton and his gang of outlaws had kept her imprisoned for nearly a month after ambushing the stagecoach she'd been traveling on. They'd kept her alive only because of her condition, planning to sell her child once it was born. The thought made bile rise in her throat. When they'd gotten careless with the guard rotation, she'd seized her chance, slipping away in the pre-dawn darkness. Now, thirst clawed at her throat, and her torn dress offered little protection against the dropping temperature. Zoe forced herself onward, knowing that stopping meant death for both her and her child. The baby kicked, as if sensing her determination, and she placed a protective hand over the movement. "Just a little farther," she promised, though she had no idea where safety might lie. Her husband James had been dead for 4 months now, killed in a mining accident back in St. Louis. She had been traveling west to live with a distant cousin in California when disaster struck. As darkness fell completely, Zoe spotted a faint glow in the distance. Hope and fear warred within her. It could be salvation, or it could be her captors. With no other option, she moved toward the light, each step an act of pure will. The smell of wood smoke reached her before she could make out the details of the small cabin nestled against the foothills. A single horse stood in a modest corral, and lamplight spilled from the windows. Zoe hesitated at the edge of the property, gathering what little strength remained. Before she could decide whether to approach, the cabin door swung open, casting a rectangle of light onto the hard, packed earth. A tall figure emerged, rifle in hand, silhouetted against the warm glow from within. "Who's out there?" A deep voice called out, steady and alert but not immediately threatening. Zoe's legs finally gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees. "Help," she managed to call, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please help us." The man approached cautiously, rifle at the ready, until he was close enough to see her condition in the dim light. His stance immediately changed. "Good Lord, madam," he said, lowering his weapon and quickly closing the distance between them. "What happened to you?" As he knelt beside her, Zoe caught her first clear glimpse of her potential savior, a man perhaps in his early 30s, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun, dark hair, and concerned eyes that assessed her condition with swift efficiency. "Escaped," she managed, her voice cracking with thirst. "They're looking for me." Understanding dawned in his eyes, and without hesitation, he scooped her up with surprising gentleness despite his powerful build. "I'm Blake Granger," he said, already carrying her toward the cabin. "And whoever they are, they'll have to come through me to get to you." As consciousness began to slip away, Zoe realized she had never felt so simultaneously terrified and safe. Her last thought before darkness claimed her was that her child might have a chance after all. When Zoe awoke, she was lying on a narrow but clean bed, covered with a patchwork quilt that smelled of sunshine and sage. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, until memory came flooding back with brutal clarity. Her hands flew to her abdomen, relief washing through her when she felt the reassuring roundness still there. "Your baby's fine, madam," came that same deep voice from across the small, tidy cabin. Zoe turned her head to see Blake Granger sitting at a simple wooden table, cleaning a revolver with methodical precision. In the lamplight, she could see him more clearly, strong jawline shadowed with several days' worth of beard, broad shoulders beneath a faded blue shirt, and eyes that were a surprising shade of green. "How long have I been asleep?" she asked, her voice stronger after rest but still raspy with thirst. Blake set aside his gun and poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup. "About 4 hours," he said, bringing it to her. "Easy now," he added as she tried to sit up too quickly. "Take it slow." His hand supported her back as she drank gratefully, the cool water like heaven against her parched throat. When she finished, he took the cup and stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm Blake Granger," he said again, apparently recognizing that she might not remember their brief introduction. "This is my place, about 20 miles outside of Las Cruces." "Zoe Parker," she replied, wincing as she shifted position. Every muscle in her body ached from days of desperate flight. "Thank you for taking me in, Mr. Granger." "Blake," he corrected with a slight nod. "And anyone who wouldn't help a lady in your condition doesn't deserve to call himself a man." He hesitated, then asked carefully, "You said someone was looking for you. Want to tell me who?" Zoe's hands twisted in the quilt. "Jesse Thornton and his men. They attacked my stagecoach a month ago, killed the driver and the other passengers." Her voice caught. "They kept me alive only because." She gestured to her swollen belly. Blake's expression hardened, his jaw tightening visibly. "Thornton," he repeated, and something in his tone suggested personal knowledge. "How many men ride with him?" "5 that I saw," she answered. "They were keeping me at an abandoned mine about 3 days' journey from here, by foot at least. She swallowed hard. "They plan to sell my baby once it's born." The look that crossed Blake's face would have terrified her if it had been directed at her. "That's not going to happen," he said with quiet certainty that somehow carried more weight than any shouted promise could have. "You're safe here, Mrs. Parker." "Miss," she corrected automatically, then shook her head. "No, it's Mrs. I'm a widow. My husband died 4 months ago." Something like understanding flashed in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, quickly wiping them away. "I was traveling to California to stay with my cousin in Sacramento. I have no one else." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "You need rest and food. Tomorrow we can figure out next steps." He moved to a small stove in the corner of the cabin and stirred something in a pot that filled the air with a savory aroma. "Think you can eat something?" The mention of food made her stomach growl audibly, and despite everything, a small smile touched her lips. "I think that's a yes." He returned the smile, briefly transforming his serious face. "Good. The little one needs strength too." As Blake ladled stew into a bowl for her, Zoe took the opportunity to observe her surroundings more carefully. The cabin was small but meticulously maintained, with a main room containing the bed she occupied, a table with 2 chairs, the cooking area, and a stone fireplace currently radiating welcome warmth. A door presumably led to another room, and shelves lined one wall, holding books more than she would have expected in a frontier cabin. "You live here alone?" she asked as he brought the food to her. He nodded. "Just me and Windwalker, that's my horse. Been that way for 3 years now." "It's a nice place," she said sincerely, accepting the bowl with thanks. "It's not much, but it's mine." There was quiet pride in his voice. "I raise horses about 5 miles north of here, but I built this place for." He paused. "Well, just as a quiet spot, I suppose." Zoe sensed there was more to that story, but the stew demanded her attention, rich with vegetables and chunks of venison. It was the first proper meal she'd had in weeks. She ate slowly, savoring each bite and feeling strength gradually return to her limbs. "This is wonderful," she said between careful spoonfuls. "Nothing special, just what was on hand." But he seemed pleased by the compliment. When she had eaten her fill, Blake took the bowl and said, "You should get more rest. I'll keep watch tonight." Zoe wanted to protest that she'd already imposed enough, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking her again. "What about you?" she managed to ask, even as her eyelids grew heavy. "I'll be fine," he assured her, gesturing to a chair near the door. "Not the first night I've spent keeping watch." There was something in his tone that hinted at a life filled with such vigils, but Zoe was too tired to puzzle it out. As sleep claimed her once more, she felt safer than she had in months, despite the knowledge that dangerous men might even now be searching for her. She awoke to early morning sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the quiet sounds of Blake moving around the cabin. When she finally opened her eyes, she found him at the stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a cast-iron skillet. "Morning," he said without turning, somehow sensing she was awake. "How are you feeling?" Zoe took mental inventory of her body. The desperate exhaustion had receded, though she was still sore and weak. "Better," she said, pushing herself carefully to a sitting position. "Thank you." Blake turned then, nodding with approval as he saw her sitting up. "Hungry, starving," she admitted with a small smile. He brought her a plate with fried potatoes and eggs, along with a cup of strong coffee. "Not fancy, but it'll keep you going. It looks wonderful." She accepted the food gratefully. "Did you sleep at all?" "Enough," he answered, though the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. He sat at the table with his own coffee, watching her eat with what seemed like satisfaction. "Mr. Granger, Blake," she corrected herself. "I can't thank you enough for your help, but I don't want to put you in danger. Those men, they're not going to stop looking for me." His expression hardened slightly. "Jesse Thornton is known in these parts. He's wanted in 3 territories and has a reputation for." He glanced at her condition and seemed to choose his words carefully. "For particular cruelties. But he's also a coward at heart, which is why he rides with a gang." Zoe shivered despite the warm food. "What should I do?" "I have no money, no transportation. First thing is to get you properly recovered," Blake interrupted firmly. "You're in no condition to travel yet. After that." He hesitated. "Las Cruces has a sheriff who's honest, at least, or I could take you to the nearest stagecoach station when you're stronger." The thought of being on a stagecoach again sent a jolt of fear through Zoe. "I can't repay you for any of this," she said softly. "I'm not asking for payment," he replied, sounding almost offended at the suggestion. "My mother raised me better than that." Something about his straightforward decency brought unexpected tears to Zoe's eyes. She blinked them back, focusing on her food instead. "Tell me about your horse ranch," she said, changing the subject. Blake's face relaxed, and for the next half hour he told her about his small but growing business breeding and training quarter horses. He spoke with obvious passion about his animals, especially a young stallion named Thunder who showed particular promise. "I was in town yesterday picking up supplies," he explained. "That's why I was here when you showed up. Usually, I'm at the main ranch during the day." "It was Providence then," Zoe said quietly. "If you hadn't been here." He met her eyes directly. "But I was." The simple statement hung between them, filled with meaning neither was ready to examine too closely. Finally, Blake stood and gathered their empty plates. "I need to check on things at the ranch today," he said. "Will you be all right here for a few hours? I'll bar the door from the outside and leave you my spare revolver." Zoe nodded, though the thought of being alone sent a flutter of anxiety through her. "I'll be fine." "You've done more than enough already." Blake retrieved a Colt revolver from a shelf and checked that it was loaded before placing it on the table beside the bed. 6 shots, he said, but I don't expect you'll need it. No one comes out this way, and Thornton's gang would be looking along the main routes to California. I know how to use it, she assured him, not mentioning that her late husband had insisted on teaching her to shoot after they were robbed in St. Louis. Please don't worry about me. It's my job to worry, he said simply, then seemed to catch himself. That is, just being neighborly. He gathered a few items and donned a weathered leather vest and hat. I'll bring back supplies. Is there anything you need? Zoe almost laughed at the question. She needed everything, having fled with literally nothing but the torn dress on her back. I'm fine, she said instead. Blake gave her a look that suggested he knew exactly what she wasn't saying. I'll see what I can find, he said cryptically, then paused at the door. Rest. Don't try to do too much. I'll be back before sundown. After he left, Zoe heard the promised bar slide into place across the door. The cabin suddenly seemed very quiet, and for the first time since her escape, she had nothing to do but think. She ran her hands over her belly, feeling the occasional movement of her child. We might be okay, she whispered. He seems like a good man. But experience had taught Zoe that good men were rare, and even they could be taken from you without warning. She couldn't afford to become dependent on Blake Granger's kindness, no matter how genuine it seemed. With that thought in mind, she slowly got to her feet, testing her strength. Still weak, but much improved from yesterday. She made her way carefully around the small cabin, examining her surroundings more thoroughly. The second room contained a wash basin, some storage, and a small desk with writing materials. Everything was simple but well made, speaking to a man who valued quality and order. On the desk sat a framed photograph of a woman with kind eyes and Blake's same strong jawline, his mother, perhaps. Back in the main room, she noticed details she'd missed before: a guitar leaning in one corner, a shelf of well-worn books ranging from practical guides to poetry, a carved wooden box that looked like it might hold personal treasures. Zoe resisted the urge to pry further. Instead, she found a bucket of clean water and used it to wash as best she could, cringing at the state of her dress and her tangled hair. There was nothing to be done about her clothing for now, but she found a comb and worked patiently through the knots in her dark blonde hair until it fell in smooth waves past her shoulders. The simple act of grooming herself restored some sense of dignity that had been stripped away during her captivity. She looked at her reflection in a small mirror hanging near the washbasin, pale, thinner than she should be at 6 months pregnant, but with a determination in her blue eyes that surprised her. We survive, she told her reflection firmly. That's what we do. The baby kicked in apparent agreement, and Zoe smiled despite everything. She returned to the bed, still tired from her ordeal, and picked up one of Blake's books, a volume of Tennyson's poetry. She was still reading when the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows through the windows. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze, the poetry forgotten as she reached for the revolver Blake had left. She moved to the window, staying to the side as she peered out cautiously. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Blake's broad-shouldered silhouette atop a magnificent black horse. He wasn't alone, though. A second horse, a gentle-looking chestnut mare, followed on a lead rope, loaded with supplies. Zoe set the gun down and waited as Blake dismounted and unbarred the door. When he entered, his arms were full of parcels, and his expression was impossible to read. Found some things you might need, he said, setting his burden on the table. And I brought Daisy back with me. Thought you might like to sit outside for a spell tomorrow if you're feeling up to it. Zoe stared at the packages, then at Blake, bewildered by his thoughtfulness. You didn't have to, I know, he interrupted gently, but I wanted to. Go on, take a look. With hesitant hands, Zoe unwrapped the parcels to find two simple but well-made dresses that would accommodate her pregnancy, undergarments, a hairbrush and other toiletries, a warm shawl, and even a pair of sturdy boots that looked close to her size. How did you know? She asked, fingering the soft fabric of a blue dress that almost matched her eyes. I have a friend in town, Martha Wilson. She runs the general store with her husband. I explained I had a visitor in need. She helps select what might fit you. He looked slightly uncomfortable, as if worried he had overstepped. If anything doesn't fit, I can take it back. Tears welled in Zoe's eyes before she could stop them. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what to say. Blake looked even more uncomfortable at her tears. It's nothing, he said gruffly. Just practical necessities. But they both knew it was more than that. It was a restoration of dignity, a recognition of her as a person worthy of care after weeks of being treated as nothing more than a vessel for a child that would be stolen from her. I'll step outside while you change, Blake said, already moving toward the door. Take your time. Once alone, Zoe quickly shed her filthy, torn dress and washed more thoroughly before donning the new undergarments and the blue dress. It fit remarkably well, considering the circumstances, and the fabric was soft against her skin. She combed her hair again and pinned it back with the hairpins Blake had included in his purchases. When she opened the door to call him back in, she found him sitting on the porch steps, whittling a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. He looked up at the sound of the door, and something in his expression made her heart beat faster. You look. He began, then seemed at a loss for words. Human again, Zoe supplied with a small smile. Blake stood, tucking away his knife and the half-formed carving. I was going to say beautiful, he said quietly, then immediately looked as if he regretted the words. I mean feeling better, I hope. Much, she assured him, pretending not to notice his discomfort or the warm glow his words had ignited within her. The dress fits perfectly. Please thank your friend for me. He nodded, visibly relieved at the change of subject. Martha said to tell you she'd be happy to call on you once you're feeling stronger. She's a good woman, trustworthy. That would be nice, Zoe said, realizing how much she missed female companionship. They went back inside, where Blake busied himself preparing a more substantial dinner than the previous night: venison steaks, potatoes, and even canned peaches for dessert. As they ate, he told her about his day at the ranch, and she shared snippets of her life before the stagecoach attack, carefully avoiding any mention of her captivity. It was strangely comfortable, as if they'd shared meals this way for years rather than just a day. Zoe found herself studying Blake when he wasn't looking, the way his hands moved with surprising grace for their size, the occasional smile that transformed his serious face, the respect with which he addressed her, never talking down to her despite her vulnerable position. After dinner, Blake insisted on taking the chair for sleeping while Zoe kept the bed. I'm used to sleeping rough, he said when she protested. And you're sleeping for two. She couldn't argue with that logic, but still felt guilty as she watched him arrange a blanket over the wooden chair. Blake, she said hesitantly as he prepared to blow out the lamp. Thank you, not just for the things, but for treating me like a person. In the dim lamplight, something flickered across his face, anger perhaps, at the implication that others had treated her as less. You don't need to thank me for basic human decency, Mrs. Parker. Zoe, she corrected softly. Please call me Zoe, he nodded, a small smile touching his lips. Good night, Zoe. Good night, Blake. As darkness filled the cabin, Zoe listened to Blake's breathing gradually slow and deepen. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without fear chasing her into her dreams. The next week passed in a gentle rhythm that began to heal Zoe's body and spirit. Each morning, Blake would prepare breakfast before heading to his ranch, leaving her with the revolver and returning by mid-afternoon. He never questioned her about her captivity, seeming to understand that she would speak of it when ready. Zoe grew stronger daily, first venturing onto the porch to sit in the sunshine, then taking short walks around the cabin with Blake beside her, ready to offer support if needed. He taught her to ride Daisy, the gentle mare he'd brought back that first day, ensuring she could escape if danger ever approached while he was away. True to Blake's word, Martha Wilson came to visit, bringing freshly baked bread and friendly conversation unmarred by prying questions. She was a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s who clearly held Blake in high regard. "That boy's been through more than most," she confided to Zoe during one visit as they sat on the porch shelling peas. "Lost his parents young, fought in the war when he was barely more than a boy, then came west to start fresh. He doesn't talk much about his past," Zoe observed, curious but reluctant to pry. Martha nodded knowingly. "Not his way, but he's a good man best I know next to my George. Patient with horses that others would give up on, fair in his dealings. Folks respect him, even if some think him too serious." Zoe thought about the rare smiles that transformed Blake's face, the quiet way he'd read poetry aloud in the evenings when she'd mentioned enjoying Tennyson, the careful distance he maintained even as he cared for her. "He's been very kind to me," she said simply. Martha hummed, giving Zoe a sidelong glance that seemed to see more than was comfortable. "Well, kindness can grow into other things given time." The comment made Zoe's cheeks warm and she changed the subject, asking about Martha's grandchildren instead. But the older woman's words lingered, awakening thoughts Zoe had been trying to suppress. She was a widow, pregnant with her late husband's child, on the run from dangerous men. The last thing she should be noticing was the way Blake's eyes crinkled when he smiled, or how safe she felt when he was near. Yet notice she did, with increasing frequency as the days passed. She found herself watching for his return each afternoon, heart lifting at the sight of him riding toward the cabin. She looked forward to their quiet evenings, when he would sometimes play the guitar while she sewed baby clothes from fabric Martha had brought, or when they would simply talk, sharing pieces of themselves in the lamplight. On her 10th day at the cabin, Zoe was sitting on the porch, enjoying the late September sunshine and the view of the distant mountains, when she spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon, riders approaching, too many to be Blake alone. Fear clenched her heart as she quickly retreated inside, grabbing the revolver from its place by the bed. Through the window, she counted 5 horsemen drawing nearer, still too distant to identify. Cold dread settled in her stomach. 5 men, just like Thornton's gang. Zoe considered her options. She could try to reach Daisy in the small corral and flee, but the riders would surely spot her. She could hide in the nearby hills, but in her condition, she wouldn't get far. Or she could stand her ground, use the cabin walls for protection, and make every bullet count. As the riders drew closer, however, she realized with overwhelming relief that Blake rode at the front of the group. The others were ranch hands, by the look of them, all on horseback driving a small herd of horses ahead of them. Zoe set the gun down with shaking hands and stepped back onto the porch as Blake separated from the group and rode toward the cabin. The other men continued with the horses, heading in the direction of his main ranch. "Everything all right?" Blake asked as he dismounted, concern evident as he took in her pale face. "Fine now," she admitted. "I saw riders and thought." Understanding dawned immediately. "I'm sorry I frightened you," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. Should have warned you we'd be moving some horses today. It's your land, Zoe reminded him with a small smile. You don't need to warn me about your comings and goings. Blake studied her for a moment, then said, I've been thinking. It's not right, you staying out here alone while I'm at the ranch most days. If you're feeling strong enough, maybe you'd like to come to the main house tomorrow. It's more comfortable and there's usually someone around. The invitation surprised her. Are you sure? I don't want to impose more than I already have. It's not an imposition, he said firmly, and it would ease my mind to have you where I can keep a better eye on things. The protective note in his voice warmed something inside her. Then I'd like that very much, she said. Blake nodded, looking pleased. Good. We'll ride over in the morning. It's not far, you've seen the direction. The house isn't fancy, but there's a proper guest room that would be yours. That evening, as they ate dinner, Blake seemed unusually pensive, almost nervous. Finally, as they finished the meal, he said, There's something I should tell you before you come to the ranch. Zoe's heart sank, her mind racing with possibilities. Was he married after all? Did he have children she didn't know about? Was there some danger he hadn't mentioned? I know Jesse Thornton, Blake said, his voice flat. Not just by reputation. I've had dealings with him in the past. Of all the things she'd imagined, this wasn't one of them. What kind of dealings? She asked carefully. Blake's jaw tightened. The kind that end with blood. My younger brother rode with him for a time, got caught up in things he shouldn't have. When Daniel wanted out, Thornton threatened to kill him. His eyes, when they met hers, were hard with old anger. I tracked them to their camp, got Daniel out. Thornton took a bullet in the process, my bullet. In his shoulder. So he's your enemy, Zoe said, feeling slightly lightheaded at this new information. He has a personal grudge, yes. Blake's expression was grim. It was 3 years ago, but a man like that doesn't forget. If he learns you're with me. It would make things worse, she finished for him, understanding dawning. You should have told me. I know. He looked genuinely regretful. At first, I wasn't sure how much to share with a stranger, then as days passed. He shook his head. There's no good excuse. You deserve to know who was helping you. Zoe considered this new information carefully. Far from frightening her away, it explained much about Blake, his vigilance, his combat readiness, his immediate understanding of the danger she faced. Where is your brother now? She asked. California, Blake answered. Married, working as a blacksmith, staying out of trouble. We write sometimes. Zoe nodded, processing everything. Thank you for telling me now, she said finally. It doesn't change my decision to go to your ranch tomorrow if that's what you're worried about. Relief visibly washed over him. I just want you to understand what you might be facing by staying with me. I understand danger, Blake, she said quietly, but I also understand safety. I haven't felt safe in months, not until I found you. Something shifted in his eyes at her words, a softening, a warmth that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might reach across the table and take her hand, but instead, he stood and began clearing their plates. We should get an early start tomorrow, he said, his back to her as he worked at the wash basin. The main house is more comfortable, but it'll take some getting used to hands coming and going, more noise than you've had here. Zoe recognized the deliberate change of subject and respected it. I'll be ready, she assured him. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Blake's steady breathing from his chair by the door, Zoe reflected on how completely her life had changed in less than 2 weeks. From captivity and terror to this strange domestic arrangement with a man who was still largely a mystery to her, yet whom she trusted more instinctively than anyone since her husband. The comparison brought a pang of guilt. James had been dead only 4 months, and already another man occupied her thoughts with increasing frequency. Yet James himself had been practical. Above all else, life is for the living, Zoe girl, he used to say, and would not have wanted her to grieve indefinitely, especially not when she had their child to consider. Their child. Zoe ran a hand over her rounded belly, feeling the occasional fluttering movement within. What kind of life could she provide for this baby? A widow with no home, no money, no family except a distant cousin she barely knew. The future loomed, uncertain and frightening despite her current safety. "We'll figure it out," she whispered to her unborn child. Somehow. She fell asleep still pondering possibilities and dreamed of wide open spaces, running horses, and a tall figure always just ahead, leading the way to something that felt remarkably like home. Morning brought a flurry of activity as they prepared to relocate to Blake's main ranch house. Zoe packed her few possessions, the clothes and personal items Blake had purchased for her, plus some baby things Martha had brought while Blake saddled Daisy and his own horse, Windwalker. The ride took less than an hour, with Blake keeping the pace easy out of concern for her condition. As they crested a small rise, Zoe got her first view of Blake Granger's horse ranch spread before them. It was more substantial than she had imagined, a large main house built of sturdy logs and local stone. Several outbuildings including a bunkhouse, impressive stables, corrals where horses of various colors grazed or exercised, and fenced pastures stretching toward distant hills. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work. "It's beautiful," she said with genuine admiration. Blake looked pleased, though he tried to hide it. "It's coming along. Started with just 10 acres and 3 horses 5 years ago. Now we're up to 200 acres and nearly 40 horses." "You've built something remarkable," Zoe said, understanding now why he spoke of his ranch with such pride. As they rode into the yard, several men looked up from their tasks, nodding respectfully to Blake and regarding Zoe with undisguised curiosity. A tall, lean man with graying hair approached as they dismounted. "Mrs. Parker, this is Samuel Hawkins, my foreman," Blake introduced them. "Sam's been with me since the beginning. Sam, this is Mrs. Zoe Parker, who will be staying with us for a time." If the foreman had any questions about her presence or her obviously pregnant condition, he kept them to himself. "Madam," he said simply, touching his hat brim. "Welcome to Granger Ranch." "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins," Zoe replied, grateful for his discretion. "Sam, would you see to Daisy, Mrs. Parker, and I will get settled in the house." The foreman nodded, taking the reins of both horses as Blake offered Zoe his arm to escort her toward the main house. She took it, conscious of the eyes following them but holding her head high. Let them wonder, she had nothing to be ashamed of. The interior of the ranch house surprised her, spacious and well-furnished, with polished wooden floors, comfortable furniture, large windows that let in abundant light, and bookshelves lining one entire wall of the main room. A stone fireplace dominated one end, and a piano stood in the corner. "This isn't what I expected," Zoe admitted, taking in the tasteful surroundings. Blake looked slightly embarrassed. "My mother was from Boston, educated. She believed that civilization wasn't just for cities." He gestured to the piano. "She taught me to play when I was young, insisted on books in the house wherever we lived." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Zoe said softly. "She was." A shadow crossed his face. "Died when I was 16, just before the war. Fever took her and my father within a month of each other." Zoe's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Blake." He acknowledged her sympathy with a nod, then seemed to shake off the memories. "Let me show you to your room. You must be tired from the ride." The guest room was large and airy, with a comfortable-looking bed, a dressing table with mirror, a wardrobe, and windows that looked out over the corrals. A small adjoining room had been set up as a washroom with a copper tub that would be a luxury after the cabin's more primitive arrangements. "This is lovely," Zoe said, running her hand along the quilt that covered the bed, handmade, with an intricate pattern of stars. "My mother's work," Blake said, noticing her admiration of the quilt. "She made one for each room before she died." Zoe looked at him with new understanding. For all his rugged exterior and capable self-sufficiency, Blake Granger carried deep attachments to his past, honoring his mother's memory in these domestic details. "I'll let you get settled," he said, moving toward the door. "My room is across the hall if you need anything." Kitchen's at the back of the house. Rosa comes in from town 3 days a week to cook and clean, but she's not here today. "There's cold ham and bread for lunch when you're hungry." "Thank you," Zoe said, suddenly feeling awkward in these more formal surroundings. At the cabin, their closeness had seemed natural, necessary. Here, with more space between them, she wasn't sure how to act. Blake seemed to sense her discomfort. "It's still just us," he said quietly. "A bigger house doesn't change anything." But it did in ways neither of them could fully articulate. At the cabin, they had been two people thrown together by circumstance, isolated from the world. Here, reality intruded. Blake had a business to run, men who depended on him, a position in the community. And Zoe was still a pregnant widow on the run, her future uncertain at best. After Blake left, Zoe unpacked her few belongings and rested on the bed, listening to the distant sounds of ranch life, men calling to each other, horses neighing, the rhythmic pounding from what must be the blacksmith's forge. It was oddly comforting, this evidence of normal life continuing around her. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, someone was knocking softly at her door. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, then called, "Come in." Blake entered, looking concerned. "I didn't mean to wake you, but it's past midday. Thought you might be hungry." "I am, actually," she admitted, realizing that she was famished. The baby seemed particularly active, as if also demanding food. "I've prepared a tray," he said, gesturing toward the door. "In the dining room if you're up to joining me, or I can bring it here if you'd prefer." "No, I'll come," Zoe said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "Just give me a moment." In the dining room, she found that Blake had indeed prepared a simple but appetizing meal: sliced ham, fresh bread, cheese, and early apples from his small orchard. He held her chair for her, a courtesy that reminded her they were no longer in the rustic confines of the cabin where such formalities had seemed unnecessary. "How are you finding the ranch?" he asked as they began to eat. "It's impressive," she said honestly. "You've accomplished so much in just 5 years." "Had a good start," he admitted. "Used my army pay to buy the first parcel of land, then got lucky with some early breeding successes. The right horse can make or break a rancher out here." "And you know horses," Zoe observed, remembering how even in her fear and exhaustion that first night, she had noticed the way he handled his mount with natural ease. "Better than I know people sometimes," Blake said with a self-deprecating smile. "Horses are straightforward. They don't hide their feelings or say one thing while meaning another. Unlike people." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "Some people," he amended, then looked directly at her. "Not you, though. You've been remarkably honest from the start." The compliment warmed her. "There seemed little point in pretense, given the circumstances of our meeting." "True enough." He refilled her water glass. "I've been thinking about your situation, Zoe, about what happens next." Her heart beat faster at the seriousness in his tone. "And what have you concluded?" "That there are options," he said carefully. "You could continue to California as you planned once the baby is born and you're strong enough to travel. I could arrange safe transport. Or," she prompted, sensing there was more, or you could stay here in Las Cruces. He focused intently on cutting a slice of apple. The town is growing. There might be opportunities for a woman of your education and capabilities. Zoe noted that he hadn't specifically suggested staying at his ranch, just in the area. I have very little money, she reminded him. What was in my reticule when the stagecoach was attacked, and that's long gone now. There's a small school that needs a teacher, Blake said. Martha mentioned it yesterday. The current schoolmistress is returning east to care for her ailing mother. A teacher. The possibility hadn't occurred to Zoe, though she had worked briefly as a governess before her marriage. With a newborn, Martha says the position comes with living quarters above the schoolroom, and she offered to help with the baby while you taught. Blake finally looked up from his plate. It's just an idea. You have time to consider your options. The thought of establishing a life here, near Blake and Martha and the others who had shown her kindness, was tempting. Yet Zoe hesitated, aware that accepting such help might create obligations she couldn't fulfill. "Why are you doing all this for me, Blake?" she asked suddenly. "The truth, please." He set down his fork, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. "At first, it was simple human decency. You needed help. I could provide it. Then—" He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. "Then I came to know you. Your courage, your resilience. The way you read poetry as if the words were water and you'd been thirsty for years. How you never complain despite everything you've endured." His eyes, when they met hers, held an emotion she wasn't ready to name. "I admire you, Zoe Parker, and I want you to have choices, real choices, not just desperate necessities." Tears pricked at Zoe's eyes and she blinked them back. "Thank you for your honesty," she said softly. Blake nodded once, then deliberately lightened his tone. "Besides, Daisy would miss you terribly if you left." Zoe smiled at that, grateful for the moment of humor that eased the intensity between them. "Well, we can't disappoint Daisy, can we?" The tension broken, they finished their meal discussing more practical matters: the running of the ranch, the approaching winter. The horses Blake was training for an important sale in November. It was comfortable, this domestic scene, and Zoe found herself imagining more such meals, more such days, stretching into a future she hadn't dared to consider. Dangerous thoughts, she told herself sternly. One day at a time was enough for now. After lunch, Blake gave her a proper tour of the ranch, the stables with their fine horses, the blacksmith's forge where a burly man named Peterson was shoeing a spirited colt, the bunkhouse where most of the hands lived, the small apple orchard that Blake's mother had insisted on planting, because a home needs growing things beyond what feeds the cattle. Everywhere they went, the men touched their hats respectfully to Zoe and addressed Blake with easy familiarity that spoke of his fair treatment and their loyalty. None asked about her presence or her condition, following their employer's lead in treating her as an honored guest whose circumstances were her own business. By late afternoon, however, Zoe was tiring, her body still rebuilding its strength after her ordeal. Blake noticed immediately when her steps began to lag. "You've done enough for one day," he said firmly, turning them back toward the main house. "Rest before dinner. Doctor's orders." "Are you a doctor now?" she teased, even as she gratefully accepted his arm for support. "No, but I've delivered enough foals to know when a mother needs rest," he replied, then immediately looked mortified at his own words. "I didn't mean that." Zoe laughed, genuinely amused by his discomfort. "It's all right, Blake. I'm not offended by the comparison. Mothers are mothers, regardless of species." His relief was palpable. Still, it was clumsily said. "I've noticed you're not always comfortable talking about my condition," Zoe observed as they walked slowly back to the house. Blake rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. It seems intrusive somehow, personal. It is personal, she agreed, but it's also obvious and becoming more so by the day. She placed a hand on her rounded belly. This baby is part of my life, a big part. You can't talk around it forever if we're to be friends. The hesitation before that last word was slight but unmistakable. What were they to each other? More than strangers now, certainly. Friends seemed inadequate, yet anything more would be presumptuous given the brevity of their acquaintance and the complexity of their situations. You're right, Blake acknowledged. It's just that I have no experience with. He gestured vaguely at her midsection. All this. Neither do I, Zoe reminded him with a small smile. It's my first. That surprised him. You seem so capable. I assumed you'd done this before. Capable is a kind word for making it up as I go along, she said wryly. They had reached the house and Blake held the door for her. Well, you make it look easy, he said. Even under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The simple compliment touched her deeply. Thank you, Blake. As she rested in her room before dinner, Zoe found herself thinking about Blake's words, not just his compliment, but his suggestion about teaching in Las Cruces. It was a practical solution, offering independence while keeping her near people who had shown her kindness. Yet something held her back from embracing the idea wholeheartedly. Was it merely caution after all she'd been through? Or was it something else entirely, something to do with the way her heart had begun to beat faster when Blake entered a room, or how his rare smiles had become precious to her? Foolishness, she told herself firmly. He's being kind, that's all. But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. There was something growing between them, fragile and unnamed but undeniably present. Whether anything would come of it remained to be seen, but denying its existence was becoming increasingly difficult. That evening, Blake cooked dinner, a skill he'd clearly developed during his years of bachelor living. The meal was simple but satisfying, and afterward, they sat in the comfortable main room, where Blake played the piano for her, nothing fancy, just old hymns and folk songs his mother had taught him, but played with feeling that suggested music meant more to him than he let on. You're full of surprises, Blake Granger, Zoe said when he finished a particularly moving rendition of Barbara Allen. Good ones, I hope, he replied with a small smile. Mostly, she teased, then grew more serious. I've been thinking about your suggestion about teaching in Las Cruces. Blake's expression revealed nothing as he waited for her to continue. It's a good idea, Zoe said slowly. Practical, but I need to know something first. What's that? She met his eyes directly. Are you offering because you want to help me become independent or because you want me to stay near you? The bluntness of her question clearly caught him off guard. For a long moment, he was silent and Zoe feared she had overstepped. Both, he finally said, his voice low but steady. I want you to have choices, real ones, and… He hesitated, then committed himself. And I find myself hoping that staying might be among those choices. It wasn't a declaration of love, yet Zoe's heart raced as if it had been. I see, she said softly. I don't expect anything, Zoe, Blake added quickly. You've been through hell. Your husband is only recently gone. You have a child coming. The last thing you need is… Is what? She prompted when he didn't finish. Complications, he said finally. I don't want to be another complication in your life. Zoe considered his words carefully. What if I told you that knowing you has been the least complicated part of my recent life? That despite everything, my widowhood, my pregnancy, my captivity, my escape, the time I've spent with you has felt right somehow? Blake's eyes widened slightly, hope and caution warring in his expression. I'd say that's a powerful statement from a woman who chooses her words as carefully as you do. It is, she agreed, and I mean every word." The air between them seemed charged with possibility, but before either could speak further, a commotion outside broke the moment. Horses approaching at speed, men's voices raised in alarm. Blake was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. What he saw made his expression harden. "Stay here," he said sharply, already reaching for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "What is it?" Zoe asked, fear clutching at her heart. "Riders, 6 or 7, moving fast." His voice was grim. "Could be nothing, could be trouble." Before she could respond, Sam Hawkins burst through the door without knocking. "Boss, we've got company. Thornton and his boys, by the look of him." Zoe's legs nearly gave way beneath her. Blake was at her side instantly, helping her to a chair. "How far out?" he asked Sam, his voice deadly calm. 10 minutes, maybe less, coming up the south road." Blake nodded once, his mind clearly working rapidly. "Get the men armed. No one shoots first, but everyone stands ready. And Sam, get word to Sheriff Davis in town. Use the back trail." The foreman nodded and disappeared, already shouting orders to the ranch hands outside. "How did they find me?" Zoe whispered, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. "Might not be you thereafter," Blake said, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Could be me. Old grudges, like I told you." But they both knew the timing was too coincidental. Somehow, Jesse Thornton had tracked Zoe to Blake's ranch. The question was whether he knew exactly where she was, or was just following a general lead. "What do we do?" Zoe asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Blake knelt before her chair, his eyes level with hers. "We have options. You could hide. There's a root cellar under the kitchen floor, or we could try to get you out the back way, put you on Daisy and send you toward town." "Or," she prompted, sensing there was a third option he wasn't voicing. "Or we stand our ground," he said simply. "My men are loyal, well armed. This is my land, my home. No one comes here making threats and leaves unscathed." The determination in his voice steadied her. "What if I don't want to hide or run?" she asked. "What if I'm tired of being afraid?" Blake studied her face, seeming to see beyond her fear to the steel beneath. "Then you stay by my side and we face them together." The choice was hers, and in that moment, Zoe understood something fundamental about Blake Granger. He would never make her decisions for her, never assume he knew what was best without consulting her wishes. It was a respect few men had shown her, even James, who had loved her but often treated her as someone to be protected rather than partnered with. "Together," she said firmly. Blake nodded once, then rose and offered his hand to help her up. "Stay behind me when they arrive," he instructed as he led her to the door. "Let me do the talking at first." Outside, Blake's men had positioned themselves strategically around the yard, some visible, others less so, all armed. Sam was nowhere to be seen, presumably already racing toward town to alert the sheriff. Blake guided Zoe to the front porch of the main house, where they stood waiting as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. His hand rested lightly at the small of her back, a gesture both protective and reassuring. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "know that I will do everything in my power to keep you safe." Zoe looked up at him, seeing the absolute conviction in his eyes. "I know," she said simply. The riders appeared at the end of the long drive leading to the ranch house, 7 men on horseback, dust rising from their horses' hooves as they approached at a controlled pace. At their head rode a man Zoe recognized immediately. His face burned into her memory from weeks of captivity, Jesse Thornton, with his distinctive scarred face and the cold eyes of a predator. Blake's posture changed subtly as he recognized Thornton, his body tensing though his expression remained impassive. "Stay calm," he murmured to Zoe. "Follow my lead." The riders pulled up about 20 yards from the house, fanning out in a semicircle. Thornton's eyes scanned the ranch buildings, noting the armed men before coming to rest on Blake and Zoe standing on the porch. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he called out. "Blake Granger. Been a while." "Not long enough, Thornton," Blake replied, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "You're trespassing on private property." Thornton ignored the warning. "I see you found something that belongs to me," he said, his gaze shifting to Zoe with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Blake's hand at her back pressed slightly, reminding her to stay behind him. "Nothing here belongs to you," he said flatly. "State your business or leave." "My business is with the lady," Thornton said, his false courtesy more menacing than outright threats would have been. "Mrs. Parker and I have unfinished matters to discuss." "The only unfinished matter," Blake replied, "is the bullet I should have put between your eyes 3 years ago. A mistake I'd be happy to rectify today." One of Thornton's men moved his hand toward his holstered gun, but Thornton himself raised a hand to stop him. Now, no need for unpleasantness. I'm just here to recover what's mine." "I am not yours," Zoe said, stepping forward to stand beside Blake, unable to remain silent any longer. "I never was." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "The law might disagree, considering I found you half dead on the trail after your stagecoach was attacked by Indians, nursed you back to health out of the goodness of my heart, only to have you steal from me and run off." He looked around at his men. "Ain't that right, boys?" The outlaws nodded, murmuring agreement with this blatant lie. Zoe felt Blake tense beside her, understanding Thornton's strategy to create a dispute that would seem legitimate to outsiders, giving him legal cover for his pursuit. "That's not what happened, and you know it," Zoe said, her voice stronger than she had expected. "You attacked the stagecoach yourself. You killed everyone else. You kept me prisoner because—" She faltered, one hand moving protectively to her belly. "Because I took pity on a poor widow in her condition," Thornton finished smoothly. "And this is the thanks I get." Blake's voice was dangerously calm. "You're calling my guest a liar and a thief, Thornton. Those are serious accusations on my property." "No offense meant to you, Granger," Thornton said with obviously false sincerity. "This is between me and the lady. Just hand her over and we'll be on our way." "That's not going to happen," Blake replied. As he spoke, Zoe noticed that his men had moved subtly closer, tightening the circle around Thornton's gang. "You have 2 choices. Ride away now and keep riding, or start something you won't finish breathing." The threat was unmistakable, and for a moment, tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Then Thornton laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "You always were direct, Granger. I appreciate that about you." His eyes hardened. "But I don't appreciate you sticking your nose in my business. The woman comes with me, her, and what she's carrying." At those words, Blake's control visibly slipped, anger flashing across his face before he mastered it. "Her child is not merchandise, Thornton, and she is under my protection now." "Protection," Thornton repeated with a sneer. "Is that what they are calling it these days? Moving awful fast for a recent widow, ain't she?" Before Blake could respond, the sound of more approaching horses drew everyone's attention. From the North Road came another group of riders, Sheriff Davis and half a dozen deputies, arriving just in time thanks to Sam's warning. Thornton's expression darkened as he assessed the changing odds. With the sheriff's arrival, his men were now significantly outnumbered. "This isn't over, Granger," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not by a long shot." "It can be," Blake countered. "Ride away and don't come back. That's the only warning you'll get." For a tense moment it seemed Thornton might ignore the warning, might order his men to draw despite the odds. But self-preservation won out, and with a final venomous glare at Zoe, he wheeled his horse around. "Let's ride, boys. Mr. Granger needs time with his guest." They rode off just as the sheriff's party reached the ranch yard, dust swirling in their wake. Sheriff Davis, a weathered man in his 50s with a reputation for fairness and courage, dismounted and approached Blake and Zoe. "Trouble?" he asked simply, eyeing the retreating outlaws. "Jesse Thornton," Blake confirmed, "making threats, trying to take Mrs. Parker here against her will." The sheriff's eyes moved to Zoe, taking in her condition with a glance that held no judgment, only professional assessment. "Mrs. Parker, I'm Sheriff Tom Davis. Would you like to make a formal complaint against Thornton and his men?" Zoe hesitated, unsure what good a complaint would do against men like Thornton who operated outside the law, but Blake's steady presence beside her gave her courage. "Yes," she said firmly, "I would." Over the next hour, Zoe told Sheriff Davis everything: the stagecoach attack, her captivity, the outlaws' plan to sell her baby, her escape, and how she had found her way to Blake's cabin. The sheriff listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small book. When she finished, Davis closed his notebook with a grim expression. "That's enough to hang Thornton and his whole gang 10 times over, madam. Problem is finding them. They don't stay in one place long." "They will now," Blake said confidently. "Thornton's too proud to just ride away. He'll be watching, waiting for an opportunity." The sheriff nodded, knowing Blake was probably right. "I'll increase patrols in the area, put the word out to neighboring counties, and I'll leave a couple of my deputies here for a few days if that's agreeable." "Appreciate it, Tom," Blake said. "But my men and I can handle ourselves." "No doubt," the sheriff agreed, "but having badges present might discourage any hasty action on Thornton's part." He turned to Zoe. "Mrs. Parker, you're welcome to stay in town if you'd feel safer. My wife would be happy to have you as our guest." Zoe looked at Blake, saw the carefully neutral expression that told her he was leaving the choice entirely to her. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, "but I'll stay here, I feel safe with Mr. Granger." If the sheriff noted the slight hesitation or the way Blake's expression softened at her words, he gave no sign. "As you wish, madam. I'll post my men just the same." He touched his hat brim in a gesture of respect. "We'll get these varmints, Mrs. Parker. You have my word on that." After the sheriff and all but 2 of his deputies had departed, Blake turned to Zoe with concern etched on his features. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though in truth, the confrontation had left her shaken. "I will be." Blake studied her face, seeming to read beyond her brave words to the fear beneath. "Come inside," he said gently. "You should rest." But once inside, Zoe found she couldn't sit still, couldn't calm the frantic beating of her heart or the racing of her thoughts. "What if he comes back?" she asked, pacing the main room despite her fatigue. "What if he waits until you're not here, or until the sheriff's men leave?" Blake moved to stand before her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders, steadying her. "Zoe, look at me," she did, finding his green eyes intent on hers. "I will not let anything happen to you or your child," he said, each word deliberate and weighted with conviction. "Not while there's breath in my body." The absolute certainty in his voice finally penetrated her fear, calming her racing heart. "I believe you," she whispered. "Good." His hands squeezed her shoulders gently before releasing her. "Now, practical matters. Until Thornton is captured, you don't go anywhere alone, not even around the ranch. One of my men or the deputies will be with you at all times." Zoe nodded, accepting the restriction as necessary. "What about you? You're in danger too because of me." "I've been in danger before," he said dismissively. "And this isn't because of you. Thornton and I have our own history. You just gave him another reason to come after me." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be," Blake replied with unexpected gentleness. "I'm not." Their eyes held for a long moment, the air between them charged with words unsaid. Then Blake cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the spell. "You should get some rest," he said. "It's been a long day." Zoe nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. The confrontation with Thornton, the fear and tension, had drained what little energy she had regained since her escape. "Good night, Blake," she said, turning toward her room. Then, impulsively, she turned back and added, "Thank you for standing with me today." "Always," he replied simply, the single word carrying a weight of promise that followed her into sleep. The next few days established a new routine at Granger Ranch. True to Blake's word, Zoe was never alone when he was busy with ranch business. Sam Hawkins, or one of the sheriff's deputies, was always nearby. The men were respectful of her privacy but vigilant, their hands never far from their weapons. Despite the constant threat hanging over them, life on the ranch continued. Blake had horses to train, men to manage, and a business to run. Zoe found ways to make herself useful, helping Rosa with household tasks when the cook was present, organizing Blake's account books which were in dire need of attention, and even assisting with the care of a newborn foal whose mother had died during birth. "You have a gentle touch," Blake observed as he watched her feed the orphaned foal from a bottle they had rigged. "He trusts you." "Animals know when you mean them no harm," Zoe replied, stroking the foal's velvety nose. "Unlike people who can be fooled by false words and promises." Blake considered her words. "Not all people are easily fooled," he said. "Some of us learn to read the truth behind the words." "Is that what you do with me?" she asked, curious. "Read beyond my words, sometimes," he admitted. "When you say you're fine but your eyes say otherwise. When you insist you're not tired but your hands tremble with exhaustion." Zoe looked up at him, surprised by his perception. "And what do you read now?" Blake studied her face for a long moment before answering. "That you're afraid, but not for yourself. That you're stronger than you believe. That you're wondering if you made the right choice staying here instead of going to town." His accuracy was unsettling. "And did I?" she asked softly. "Only you can't answer that," Blake replied. "But for what it's worth, I believe you did, not just because I can protect you here, but because—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "because you belong here." The words sent a shiver of awareness through Zoe. "Blake." But whatever she might have said was interrupted by the arrival of Sam Hawkins, his expression troubled. "Boss, we've got a problem with the south pasture fence. Looks like someone cut it in the night, lost about a dozen horses before we noticed." Blake's face hardened with anger. "Thornton," he said flatly. "This has his mark all over it, petty damage to draw us out, thin our defenses." He turned to Zoe. "Stay here, Sam will watch over you. I need to see to this personally." Before she could protest, he was striding away, calling for his horse and several of the hands to accompany him. Zoe watched him go, a cold knot of fear forming in her stomach. "He'll be fine, madam," Sam assured her, noting her concern. "Blake Granger can handle himself in any fight." "It's not just any fight, though, is it?" Zoe replied. "Thornton hates him, and now he hates me too." Sam's weathered face was grim as he nodded. "That's the truth of it, madam, but hate makes men careless, and Thornton's pride will be his downfall. Mark my words." Zoe wished she could share his certainty. As the day wore on with no sign of Blake's return, her anxiety grew. By late afternoon, she had worn a path in the porch boards from her constant pacing, despite Sam's attempts to reassure her. When riders finally appeared on the horizon, Zoe held her breath until she could make out Blake's familiar figure at the head of the group. Relief washed through her, so intense that her knees nearly buckled. But as they drew closer, she realized something was wrong. Blake was riding slumped in his saddle, supported by one of his men. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. "Blake," she cried, rushing down the porch steps despite Sam's attempt to hold her back. The riders entered the yard, and Zoe reached Blake's horse just as two of his men were helping him dismount. His face was pale with pain and blood loss, his shirt torn where a bullet had torn through flesh. "It's not as bad as it looks," he managed to say when he saw her stricken expression. "Just a graze." "That's no graze," she contradicted, already examining the wound with careful hands. "Inside now. Sam, I need hot water, clean cloths, and your strongest whiskey." With the men's help, they got Blake into the house and onto his bed. As Zoe cut away his bloodied shirt, she forced herself to set aside her fear and focus on the task at hand. The wound was indeed not as bad as it could have been. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting bone or any vital structures, but it was still serious, still bleeding freely. "What happened?" she asked as she cleaned the wound, her hands steady despite her inner turmoil. Blake winced as the whiskey-soaked cloth touched torn flesh. "Ambush," he said through gritted teeth. "Thornton's men were waiting near the cut fence, started shooting as soon as we rode up. Did anyone else get hurt?" Zoe couldn't bring herself to ask directly if Blake had killed anyone in the exchange. "Two of Thornton's men won't be troubling anyone again," he answered, understanding her unspoken question. "The rest scattered when my boys returned fire. None of my men were seriously hurt. Peterson took a bullet in the arm, but it's just a scratch." Zoe nodded, focusing on bandaging his shoulder with strips of clean linen. "You need a doctor." "Sam's already sent for one," Blake assured her, "but you're doing fine." He caught her hand as she worked, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I'm all right, Zoe. I've had worse." "That doesn't make it better," she said, her voice catching. "This is because of me, because you're protecting me." Blake's grip on her hand tightened. "No. This is because Jesse Thornton is a coward who attacks from hiding. And it changes nothing. I would still take you in if you showed up at my door tomorrow." The simple declaration, made despite his pain and blood loss, pierced Zoe's heart. "Why?" she whispered. For a long moment, Blake just looked at her, his green eyes intense despite his weakened state. "Because from the moment I found you in the darkness, something in me recognized something in you," he said finally. "As if a part of me had been waiting, not even knowing what it was waiting for until you were there." Zoe's breath caught at his words, at the raw honesty in them. "Blake." He closed his eyes briefly as if gathering his strength. "I'm not asking for anything, Zoe. I know your husband is only recently gone. I know you have your child to think of, but I wanted you to know this isn't just charity or protection. This is—" He struggled to find the right words. "This matters to me. You matter." Tears filled Zoe's eyes, spilling onto her cheeks before she could stop them. "You matter to me too," she admitted softly. "More than I should allow, perhaps." Blake reached up to brush away a tear with his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle. "We can figure out what that means later," he said. "For now, just know that I don't regret a single choice that led to this moment, bullet wound included." A knock at the bedroom door interrupted them, and Sam entered with the news that the doctor was arriving. Zoe quickly finished bandaging Blake's shoulder, then stepped back to allow the physician, a rotund, bearded man named Dr. Henderson, to examine him. "Good field dressing," the doctor commented, inspecting Zoe's work. "You've done this before." "My husband worked in the mines," she explained. "Injuries were common." Dr. Henderson nodded, then proceeded to clean and properly stitch Blake's wound, confirming Zoe's assessment that it had missed anything vital. "You're a lucky man, Granger," he said as he worked. "An inch to the right and we'd be having a very different conversation." "I've always had good fortune," Blake replied, his eyes finding Zoe's across the room. Once the doctor had finished and departed, leaving instructions and laudanum for pain that Blake would undoubtedly refuse to take, Zoe insisted that he rest. "No arguments," she said firmly when he tried to protest. "You've lost blood. You need to recover your strength." "Yes, madam," Blake said with a shadow of his usual humor, "but only if you promise to rest too. You're in no condition to be nursing gunshot victims all night." "I'm stronger than I look," Zoe reminded him, "but I promise to lie down if you promise to stay in that bed." "Deal," he agreed, his eyes already drooping with exhaustion and the effects of the pain medicine the doctor had administered before leaving. Zoe waited until his breathing deepened into sleep before quietly leaving the room, keeping the door ajar so she could hear if he needed anything. In the main room, she found Sam and several of the hands waiting for news. "He'll be fine," she assured them. "The doctor says he was lucky." Relief was evident on every face. "Good to hear, madam," Sam said. "Blake's like a brother to most of us, more than a boss." "I can see that," Zoe replied, touched by their obvious concern and loyalty. "Sheriff Davis sent word," one of the younger hands added. "He's forming a proper posse tomorrow to go after Thornton. Says this ambush was the last straw." Zoe nodded, though worry gnawed at her. A posse meant Blake would insist on joining, wounded or not, once he learned of it, and that meant more danger, more potential for harm. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Now all of you should get some rest. I'll watch over him tonight." The men nodded and filed out, leaving only Sam behind. "You need anything, madam, you just call. I'll be right outside all night." "Thank you, Sam," Zoe said sincerely, "for everything." Left alone, she checked on Blake once more, finding him still sleeping deeply. His face relaxed in a way it rarely was when he was awake. She resisted the urge to smooth back the dark hair that fell across his forehead, to touch the strong line of his jaw now softened in sleep. Instead, she settled into a chair near his bed, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, prepared for her vigil. Outside, night had fallen, bringing with it a chill that penetrated the sturdy log walls of the ranch house. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonesome cry echoing across the valley. As she watched Blake sleep, Zoe reflected on how completely her life had changed in the span of less than 3 weeks. From captivity and despair to this concern for a man who had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "We're going to be all right," she whispered, one hand resting on her belly where her child slumbered. "All of us." Whether it was a prayer or a promise, even she couldn't say. Dawn found Zoe still in her chair, having dozed fitfully throughout the night, waking at each small sound to check on Blake. He had slept deeply, thanks to the doctor's medicine, but as the first light filtered through the window, he began to stir. "Water," he croaked, his voice rough with sleep and thirst. Zoe was instantly alert, bringing a glass to his lips and helping him drink. "How do you feel?" she asked when he had finished. "Like I've been shot," Blake replied with a weak attempt at humor. His eyes, however, were clearer than she expected, already assessing his condition and surroundings. "You stayed all night." It wasn't a question, but Zoe nodded anyway. "I wanted to be sure you were all right." Blake shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "You shouldn't have. You need proper rest, especially in your condition." "I'm fine," she assured him. "And you're not exactly in a position to scold anyone about taking care of themselves." That drew a reluctant smile from him. "Fair point." He pushed himself to a sitting position, ignoring Zoe's protests. "What's happening with Thornton? Has there been any word?" Zoe hesitated, debating whether to tell him about the posse, knowing it would only drive him to attempt joining despite his injury. but lying would be disrespectful of the trust growing between them. "Sheriff Davis is forming a posse today," she admitted. "After the ambush, he's determined to bring Thornton in." As expected, Blake immediately tried to get up. "I need to be there. Sam will know where my spare gun belt is." "Blake Granger, you are not leaving that bed," Zoe said firmly, placing a hand on his uninjured shoulder to keep him in place. "You've lost blood, you have a hole in your shoulder, and you're in no condition to ride with any posse." "Thornton is my problem," Blake insisted. "I should be there when they take him." "He's the law's problem now," Zoe countered. "And you've already done more than enough. Please, Blake, stay here, recover. Let the sheriff handle this." They locked eyes in a silent battle of wills, neither willing to back down. Finally, Blake sighed. "At least let me talk to Sam, see what the plan is." It was a compromise, and Zoe recognized it as such. "All right, I'll get him. But you stay in that bed, or so help me, I'll have the men tie you to it." Blake's eyebrows rose at her vehemence. "Yes, madam," he said, a glint of humor in his eyes despite the seriousness of the situation. Zoe went to find Sam, who was already awake and checking on the men stationed around the property. When she returned with him, Blake was sitting up straighter, looking more like his usual self despite the pallor that spoke of his injury. "Sam, what's the plan with this posse?" Blake asked without preamble. The foreman glanced at Zoe, then back to his boss. "Sheriff's gathering men in town at noon. They've got a lead on Thornton's camp. One of his men was captured last night trying to steal horses from the Miller place. Talked pretty quick once Davis got hold of him." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "You're going?" "Plan to, boss, with your permission." "Figured you'd want Granger Ranch represented." "Good man." Blake's approval was evident. "Take Peterson, Jenkins, and Caleb. Leave the others here to watch the ranch. And Sam, make sure Thornton knows exactly who's coming for him." "Will do, boss." Sam's grim satisfaction suggested he would take particular pleasure in that task. After Sam left, Blake turned to Zoe. "I don't like staying behind," he admitted, "but you're right, I'd be a liability in this condition." "Thank you for seeing reason," Zoe said, relief evident in her voice. "Now you need to eat something. I'll bring you breakfast." As she turned to go, Blake caught her hand. "Zoe, be careful today. Thornton might use the posse as a distraction to come after you here." The possibility hadn't occurred to her, and she felt a chill of fear. "You think he would?" "I think he's desperate and vindictive," Blake said seriously. "That makes him dangerous. Stay close to the house. Keep a weapon nearby." Zoe nodded, squeezing his hand in acknowledgement. "I will. Now rest. I'll be back soon." The day passed with agonizing slowness. Blake insisted on getting up despite Zoe's objections, though he conceded to remaining in the house. By mid-afternoon, he was pacing the main room like a caged predator, pausing occasionally to check his pocket watch or peer out the windows toward the road to town. "This waiting is worse than being shot," he muttered during one such circuit. Zoe, who had been mending one of his shirts to keep her hands busy, looked up with a raised eyebrow. "I doubt that very much." Blake had the grace to look sheepish. "Perhaps not literally, but it's damned close." "Language," she chided automatically, then smiled at his surprised expression. "I'm about to be a mother. I need to practice appropriate outrage at such things." That startled a laugh from him, the sound warming her heart. "Fair enough. I'll try to moderate my vocabulary around the little one." There was something deeply touching about his casual acceptance of her child, his easy inclusion of the baby in his thoughts for the future. Zoe had noticed it before, the way he referred to the little one with a mix of reverence and protectiveness, as if the child were already precious to him, despite no blood connection. Before she could examine that thought further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Blake moved swiftly to the window, his injured arm held carefully against his body. "It's Sam," he said, relief evident in his voice. "And the boys with him. They're riding easy, not like they're being pursued." Zoe joined him at the window, watching as the men rode into the yard. Even from a distance, she could see that they were tired but not wounded, their postures suggesting success rather than defeat. Blake was already heading for the door, Zoe close behind him. They reached the porch just as Sam dismounted, his weathered face split by a satisfied grin. "Got him, boss," he announced without preamble. "Thornton and what's left of his gang are in Sheriff Davis's jail. 2 didn't make it, tried to shoot their way out. The rest surrendered when they saw they were outnumbered." A wave of relief so profound it was almost dizzying washed over Zoe. She reached for the porch railing to steady herself, and Blake's hand was immediately at her elbow, supporting her despite his own injury. "Thornton himself?" Blake asked, his voice taut with tension. "Alive," Sam confirmed. "Took a bullet in the leg, but he'll live to hang." "Sheriff's already wired the federal marshal. They've been after Thornton for years. He's wanted in 3 territories." "And the others?" "They'll confirm Mrs. Parker's story about the stagecoach attack, her captivity." Sam nodded. 2 of them already started talking, trying to save their own hides. "Corroborated everything she told us." Zoe closed her eyes briefly, a sob of relief catching in her throat. It was over. After weeks of terror, flight, uncertainty, it was finally over. Blake's arm went around her shoulders, drawing her against his side in a gesture that was both protective and celebratory. "Thank you, Sam," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You and the boys did good work today." "Just following your lead, boss," Sam replied simply. Then, with a knowing look at Blake's arm around Zoe, he added, "I'll see to the horses. You 2 probably have things to discuss." As Sam led the other men toward the stables, Blake turned to Zoe, his face alight with fierce joy. "It's over," he said, echoing her thoughts. "You're safe now." Truly safe. Zoe looked up at him, seeing the man who had become her protector, her friend, and perhaps something more, something neither of them had yet fully acknowledged or explored. "Because of you," she said softly. Blake shook his head. "Because of your own courage. You escaped, you survived, you testified. I just provided a safe harbor." "You provided much more than that," Zoe contradicted gently. She hesitated, then added, "The question now is, what happens next?" The words hung between them, laden with possibility. Blake's arm was still around her shoulders, warm and steady, but she could feel a new tension in him, not fear or worry, but anticipation, perhaps, or uncertainty about her meaning. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want to happen next." Zoe considered her answer, knowing it would shape whatever lay ahead for both of them. "I still plan to have this baby," she said with a small smile, placing a hand on her rounded belly. "That much hasn't changed." "I should hope not," Blake replied, matching her lighter tone. "I've already started carving a cradle." The casual revelation touched her deeply. "Have you really?" He nodded, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "Been working on it in the evenings. Nothing fancy but solid, safe. Like you," Zoe thought but didn't say. Instead, she continued, "Beyond that, I've been thinking about your suggestion, about teaching in Las Cruces." "It's still a good option," Blake said carefully, though something in his eyes suggested he hoped for a different answer. "The position is still open, according to Martha." "It is a good option," Zoe agreed, "but I've been wondering if perhaps there might be another." Blake's arm tightened almost imperceptibly around her shoulders. "Such as?" Zoe turned to face him fully, looking directly into his eyes as she took this leap of faith. "Such as staying here. Not just until the baby comes, but after, if that's something you might want." The hope that bloomed in Blake's expression was answer enough, but he still asked, "Are you sure, Zoe? It hasn't even been a month." "Your husband, James, would want me to be happy," she interrupted gently. to find a good man who would care for his child as his own. And I think I may have found that man if he's willing." For a moment, Blake seemed speechless, his eyes searching her face as if to confirm the sincerity of her words. Then, with infinite care, he raised his hand to cup her cheek. "I fell in love with you that first night," he admitted softly. "Exhausted, frightened, pregnant, none of that mattered. I saw your courage, your determination to protect your child at any cost. How could I not love that?" Tears welled in Zoe's eyes at his words, at the naked honesty in them. "I don't know if what I feel is love yet," she said truthfully. "But I know that when I imagine my future, you're in it. You and this ranch and a life we might build together. Is that enough for now?" Blake's smile was answer enough, but he spoke the words anyway. "It's more than enough. We have time, Zoe. All the time we need." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise. Zoe's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm as she returned the kiss, allowing herself to embrace this unexpected happiness. When they finally broke apart, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Build a life here with me." "Yes," Zoe replied simply. And in that moment, all the uncertainty and fear of the past month seemed to fall away, replaced by a quiet certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. 2 months later, as the first snow dusted the mountains surrounding Granger Ranch, Zoe stood by the window of what was now their bedroom, watching Blake in the yard below as he instructed a group of new hands in the proper care of the horses. Her hands rested on her now prominent belly, feeling the increasingly vigorous movements of the child within. So much had changed since that desperate night when she had stumbled out of the darkness and into Blake's life. Jesse Thornton and his remaining men had been tried and convicted, their testimony confirming everything Zoe had experienced. They would spend the rest of their lives in prison for their crimes. Sheriff Davis had become a regular visitor to the ranch, often bringing his wife who had taken a motherly interest in Zoe's pregnancy. Martha Wilson continued her friendship as well, providing practical advice and warm companionship as Zoe adjusted to ranch life and prepared for motherhood. And Blake had become the center of her world in ways Zoe had never imagined possible when they first met. Their love had grown steadily, built on mutual respect, shared values, and the deep connection that had sparked from their very first meeting. They had married quietly 6 weeks after Thornton's capture, with Sheriff Davis and his wife, the Wilsons, Sam Hawkins, and a few other close friends in attendance. Blake had insisted, not out of concern for appearances, but because, as he put it, "I want your child to be born a Granger." The cradle he had promised stood ready in the corner of their bedroom, beautifully crafted from rich walnut wood, with a small carved horse watching over the headboard, Blake's talisman of protection for the coming child. As she watched him now, directing the men with the easy authority that came naturally to him, Zoe felt a surge of gratitude for the unlikely chain of events that had brought them together. Her escape from captivity had led not just to physical safety but to emotional sanctuary as well, to a love she hadn't been looking for but now couldn't imagine living without. Blake looked up, somehow sensing her gaze, and raised a hand in greeting. Zoe returned the gesture, smiling as he excused himself from the men and headed toward the house. "Everything all right?" he asked as he entered, immediately crossing to her side, his hand joining hers on her belly. "Perfect," she assured him. "Your son or daughter is just particularly active today." Blake's face lit up with wonder, as it always did when they spoke of the baby. "Good, strong like his mother." "Or her father," Zoe countered with a smile. Blake pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of her advanced pregnancy. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone suggesting he had been considering this for some time. "What would you think about naming the baby after your first husband if it's a boy, to honor his memory?" The suggestion caught Zoe by surprise, touching her deeply with its generosity of spirit. "You would do that, of course," Blake said simply. "He gave me the greatest gift I could imagine you, and this child I already love as my own. It seems right to acknowledge that." Tears welled in Zoe's eyes. The pregnancy had made her more emotional, or perhaps it was just Blake's consistent thoughtfulness that moved her so. "James Blake Granger," she said softly. "It has a good sound to it." "It does," he agreed. "And if it's a girl—" Zoe had already been thinking about this. "Elizabeth, after your mother. Elizabeth Rose Granger." Now it was Blake's turn to look moved. "She would have loved that, almost as much as she would have loved you." They stood together by the window, watching as snow began to fall more heavily, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. In the stables, the horses nickered softly, warm and secure. From the bunkhouse came the distant sound of a harmonica playing a cheerful tune. All around them, life continued its steady rhythm, a rhythm they were now part of together. "I never imagined this," Zoe confessed, leaning against Blake's solid strength. "When I escaped, all I could think about was survival, hour to hour, day to day. The idea of happiness seemed impossible." Blake pressed a kiss to her temple. "Life has a way of surprising us, especially when we least expect it." "So it does," she agreed, turning in his arms to face him. "Thank you for being my champion when I needed one most." "Always," he promised, the simple word carrying the weight of a vow. "For you, for our child, for any others who might come along, always." As dusk fell and the snow continued to blanket the world outside, Zoe and Blake Granger remained by the window, watching the transformation of their land, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by courage, and by love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. When Elizabeth Rose Granger was born on a clear January morning in 1879, her first cry echoed through the ranch house, announcing her arrival to a world very different from the one her mother had fled in terror just months before. With Blake holding Zoe's hand through every moment of the difficult birth, and Martha Wilson serving as midwife, the baby entered a world filled with love and protection. Blake wept unashamedly when he first held her, this tiny perfect being with wisps of blonde hair like her mother's, and when they occasionally opened, eyes that promised to be as green as his own. "She's magnificent," he whispered, carefully returning her to Zoe's arms, "just like her mother." As spring returned to the New Mexico territory, bringing new life to the ranch in the form of foals, calves, and wildflowers dotting the hillsides, the Grangers settled into their new reality as a family. Elizabeth, or Libby, as Blake had taken to calling her, thrived under their care, growing stronger each day, her curious eyes taking in the world around her. Word spread through Las Cruces and the surrounding area about the courageous woman who had escaped captivity, found sanctuary with the taciturn horse rancher, and transformed not only her own life, but his as well. Their story became something of a local legend, embellished with each telling until Blake joked that future generations would have him single-handedly fighting off 50 outlaws, while Zoe delivered her own baby during a blizzard. Reality was both simpler and more profound. They built their life together day by day, Blake, expanding his horse breeding business with Zoe's organizational skills, bringing new efficiency to the operation. Zoe starting a small school on the ranch for the children of the hands and neighboring properties, both of them raising their daughter with love and the quiet determination that had brought them together. 3 years after Libby's birth, Zoe gave birth to twins James Blake and Daniel Samuel Granger, adding joyful chaos to their already full lives. Blake proved to be a natural father, as patient and gentle with his children as he was with his horses, teaching them to ride almost as soon as they could walk, reading to them from the same books his mother had read to him, instilling in them the values of hard work, honesty, and compassion that had shaped his own life. On the 5th anniversary of the day Zoe had stumbled out of the darkness and into Blake's protection, they stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Libby was inside, helping Martha Wilson bake a cake for the occasion while the twins napped after a day of excited exploration. 5 years, Zoe marveled, leaning against Blake's side. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it seems like another lifetime entirely. Blake's arm tightened around her waist. Best day of my life, though I didn't know it at the time. Even better than our wedding day, or when the children were born, she teased. Those are tied for second place, he replied with a smile. But that first day, that was when everything changed. When you showed up and turned my carefully ordered life upside down. I seem to recall you didn't mind too much, Zoe said, returning his smile with one of her own. Not even for a moment, Blake admitted. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. I have something for you. An anniversary gift. Curious, Zoe opened the pouch and gasped when a delicate gold locket slid into her palm. The oval pendant was intricately engraved with tiny flowers, and when she opened it, contained miniature portraits of their 3 children on one side and Blake on the other. Blake, it's beautiful, she whispered, deeply touched by the thoughtful gift. Open the back, he instructed softly. Zoe turned the locket over and discovered another clasp. When opened, it revealed an inscription in tiny, precise lettering. For my Zoe, who found me when I didn't know I was lost. All my love always. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at the man who had become everything to her protector, partner, lover, father to her children. Help me put it on, she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Blake fastened the locket around her neck with gentle hands, then pressed a kiss to the spot where it rested against her skin. I love you, Zoe Granger, he said simply. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. And I love you, she replied, turning in his arms to face him fully. My champion, then and now and always. As they sealed their words with a kiss, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Granger Ranch, stars that had witnessed their beginning on that desperate night 5 years ago, and now shone down on the life and love they had built together, a testament to courage, compassion, and the healing power of finding home in another's heart.